welcoming everybody. I am Susie DeYoung. I am the founder of Trauma Informed Parent, and I'm here with the newest member of our team, Catherine Galda, who is a psychotherapist in the field of trauma, recovery, and resilience. And some of you may know if you were here last time, but for those who weren't, Trauma Informed Parent was started about 10 years ago. It was started as a way to offer other parents and caregivers access to resources and information about trauma that I didn't have in 2004 when my son suffered a very, very serious traumatic accident. And while the medical care he received was wonderful, we kind of had to learn as we went along in regard to trauma. So welcome everybody and thank you. As Catherine said, the session's being recorded, so make sure you're muted and your camera's on if you're comfortable with that. We also really appreciate you joining. There's a lot of experts and a lot of information on trauma on the internet, but what you'll get from Catherine and I that's often lacking on other forums is that we've both worked in the field a very long time and we both have children who have suffered traumatic accidents. Before we get rolling, I just want to go over some guidelines. This
Susie,
topic.
can I interrupt 1 second? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
I am just going to share my screen because they can't see what we see. Sorry about that, guys. All right, go ahead and I will take it from here.
Guidelines for tonight. The topic that we're talking about can be emotionally evocative for some. It's very stressful, so please take care of yourself. If you need to take a break, if you need to leave, go right ahead. We are recording it, and we will make the recording available for everyone. We're also here to offer information and resources, not therapy. Though Catherine is a certified therapist, the purpose of the webinar is solely informational. And this is our second webinar, so forgive any technical snafus and please practice kindness. Also, there will be questions and we hope to get to as many as possible. Please put them in the chat during the presentation if you have any questions. And we'd love to get to know you better. So if you don't mind taking a moment to put in the chat your first name, where you're zooming in from, what your role is with your child, mom, dad, grandparent, foster parent, adoptive parent. And one other thing, in coming weeks, we're going to be offering 12-week small group coaching sessions. It'll offer an opportunity for small group interaction, curated articles, videos, especially for attendees. And information on that will be posted on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and we will email those of you who are here this evening. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Okay. So a couple of things. We do have some guidelines for tonight that I just want to highlight one or two that Susie didn't mention. Just be mindful of yourselves. I know Susie said that originally, but be aware of all the things that you're feeling tonight. Make room for that. Be kind to yourself. Notice, and just allow those feelings to come up and to be there and to pass through you. Come with an open mind. You're gonna, because you're here, you already have a lot of knowledge walking through the door. So come with an open mind. You might learn something tonight that you didn't already know. Certainly being respectful, non-judgmental, and holding space for each other are all important things that we need to do every time we come together in a group forum. So if I make my technology work, my technology doesn't want to work. Let's see. Oh, here we go. It's deciding it wants to work. All right. So this is essentially what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to talk quite a bit about why we're here. This is caregiver resilience. So by its very virtue of its title, it's talking about what resilience is and how do we not only, how do we gain it? How do we keep it? How do we build it and grow it? And so we're going to talk a lot tonight about trauma from that perspective of what it is and what it means to be a parent of a young person who has gone through traumatic experience. And what that does to us. And that's really important because we're with our children all the time. We're with our young people all the time. And as they change and grow, we have to adapt with them with that. And when you throw trauma into the mix, whether it's simple or complex, it changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic between the two of you. It changes how you respond to them and vice versa. So we're going to talk a lot about that. At the end of this time, I have a wonderful packet that has been cobbled together over many years of my practice life, and I'm going to share it with you. It has a bunch of resources in it, but I'm not going to give it to anybody until the end because I don't want you guys looking through that and missing anything important that we're going to talk about. So let me just move us here. Perfect. Okay. So when we're thinking about resilience, what is it? Right? I'm sure all of us have heard like, oh, resilience is like a rubber band and, it's our ability to kind of bounce back. Yeah, it's our ability to bounce back from traumatic experience, from the hardships of life. You're in this room, we all lived through COVID together. Um, that's a great example of kind of how resilience um, how we need to bring special skills to the table and how our resilience can be drained by prolonged exposure to highly stressful and traumatizing events. Um, why do we need to have resilience? We need to have resilience within us so that we can cope. Life is hard and maybe harder today than at other times. I don't know. I keep wishing that my father were here. He'd be 110 now, if you can believe that. But I wish sometimes that he were here so that I could ask him, like, hey, is this, oh, did I do something terrible here? Sorry. Is this a different kind of time in history than when you lived? But alas, he is not. So we're just dealing with the present that we have and the life that we're living. So we build our resilience because we need it for ourselves, but it also flavors and colors how we parent or co-parent or grandparent, because it helps us be able to deal with the stressors that come our way. And according to what I've written down here in the slide, and what's really important to know is that when you're living with somebody who's been impacted by trauma, it impacts everyone. Um, Susie didn't mention it in this webinar, but we talked about it in our intro and we talked about it in the first webinar. My daughter is a survivor of the Sandy Hook school shootings. I myself have a history of trauma. So when parenting her and dealing with her in those early days, weeks, and months after Sandy Hook, it was a different kind of parenting. It was a different kind of house, and we had to really scramble to adapt to kind of what ended up being, I hate the phrase our new normal, but I'm going to have to use it because it's the only thing I can think of at the moment to say our new normal way of being together. What is helpful for us as adults and as parents is really to develop and grow our understanding of traumatic experience, where we fall on that continuum, whether we have a compounded trauma or a simple trauma in our own histories, and what happens to us as individuals when we're parenting our children through some kind of suffering that they're going through. So we'll be able to recognize and understand ourselves more effectively. We're going to talk about risk and protective factors because they're very important. We're going to talk about the different types of trauma. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I do want to spend some time so we can help ourselves to identify, if maybe we fall into one of these categories. Maybe we need to look at getting more support or evaluate the support that we have in our lives right now. Um, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. So piece, this piece here talks a little bit definitionally about stress, distress, primary traumatic experience, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma. If we were a smaller group, I would ask people to like raise their hands here and tell me what you think about this. Tell me if you understand, the difference between secondary and vicarious trauma. But it's important for us to note as parents of children who have been impacted or grandparents of children who have been impacted, kind of where we fall on this continuum. Have we ourselves had a primary traumatic experience, which can be a single experience or multiple experiences over time that are kind of considered outside what is typical of daily life. Often in those experiences, we perceive or actually experience a life-threatening event like a car accident or something akin to that, a medical tragedy. But the primary component in traumatic experience is that our life, we feel unsafe. unsafe in the world that, yesterday we felt just fine in, we felt okay, and now today, not so much. Um, Primary traumatic experiences, and again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this. So, Susie, I'll ask for your help here to make sure that I don't go too far down the rabbit hole because I'm a bit of a mental health nerd, so I tend to whoop, in the wrong direction. Um, but when we're looking at primary traumatic experiences, most people recover just fine. Most of us, a lot of the students at Sandy Hook recovered just fine. A portion of those, however, so you have a large population that went through a very similar experience, not the same, but a similar experience. And some of those students, some of those families fared just fine. Some did not. There's not a direct causal link as to why one family or one individual, has PTSD and another does not. There's a lot of variables and factors that I won't go into tonight. Um, but it has a lot to do with kind of where you are before the trauma, if you've had trauma in your past already, and those variables can kind of lend themselves to the eventual kind of worsening of those signs and symptoms. If you're a parent of a young person who has been traumatized, um, better than I inside your own home, what has changed? What is different with your child? What is different in the dynamic of your family? Who is in your family at this point? If it's a traumatic loss, your family system and the individuals within that family system have experienced something devastating. And we as parents are very much prone to this secondary traumatic experience or secondary trauma. And that is resultant from living with and being in connection to someone who has been traumatized. So you're listening to their stories, the resultant behavioral, emotional, psychological, and physical changes that are now in your home kind of on a daily basis puts us as the caregivers at risk for experiencing symptoms of trauma. If
And if
we
I
were
might interrupt, I think my husband and I are actually a good example of this in terms of when our son had his accident in 2004, because I had grown up with early childhood trauma. I had grown up in a home where there was substance abuse and some domestic violence, and my husband did not. And I responded to the trauma at first, very, very take charge. People were calling me Superwoman. How do you do that? I was not showing any stress or falling apart, whereas my husband was more emotive, which was actually the more normal reaction. And it was 6 months later that I actually started feeling the effects of the trauma and the feeling out of control. So it really can show itself, like Catherine was saying, when you have your own history of trauma in different ways.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Susie. You're absolutely right. And it can show up 6 months later, right? A year later. Sometimes not until the next traumatic moment happens, right? We all have traumatic moments throughout our lives, and so sometimes something will come up that'll smack up against a previous experience. Um, so going back here, being vulnerable to secondary trauma makes it really important for us as parents and caregivers to be able to understand where we are, understand what's going on inside of us, and deal with that as best we can, right? Within ourselves, within our families, within our communities, with other supports. And so that's really where we're going to focus our time and energy tonight. I threw in vicarious trauma because often you see secondary and vicarious interchangeably, and they're not the same. Right? They're not the same. Vicarious traumatization is something that happens more to people like me as a mental health professional, where I listen to and am part of and walking alongside people through their traumas day after day of my practice life. Um, and what can happen as a result of that is that you can have a cumulative traumatic experience. Um, so let's see. Sorry, my timer went off for my 5-minute counter, so I just need to reset that. Um, so one of the things that I think is important to take a minute before I switch slides and talk about is what primary or secondary traumatic experience, what the symptoms look like. We can have any kind of um, symptoms that are associated with, the aftermath of a traumatic experience. So we can be prone to nightmares, to heightened levels of anxiety or perception of stress. We can have instances where we have difficulty sleeping, difficulty coping, difficulty thinking, right? Can you imagine, how difficult? I remember in the early days after Sandy Hook, my brain just felt like it left me. You know, I was functioning fine. I was getting up and doing the things that I needed to do, but I couldn't focus. I couldn't concentrate, and that's a really common experience after a traumatic event. Difficulty with complex problem solving, avoidance. That's a big one. Whether it's avoiding people, places, and things, or avoiding thoughts, topics, pushing things away from us, not dealing. All of those are symptoms that present themselves not necessarily all together, but in parts after we experience a trauma. For most of us, those go away within a month or 6 weeks, but for some they do not. And those are the folks that I'm kind of speaking to here, right? When we have things that are persisting with us, sometimes we need to get more support. So there are things that we can do, right? Or things that we can do to help ourselves and things that don't help us or are kind of risk factors. So when we talk about risk and protective factors, we're talking about the things that lift and the things that lean. Right? So what is helping us and what is maybe pushing down against us or something that we're doing that helps in the short term but doesn't help in the long term. So I don't think that anybody would is seeing anything here that is particularly earth shattering, right? This is stuff that, as you guys have been walking through your lives, I'm sure that you have experienced, right? That repeated exposure to your young person's traumatic events, the retellings of the story, the sharing with them, you leaning into them and wanting to be there for them because that's what we do as parents. Um, that can put us at risk, and that can actually make us a little bit more symptomatic. Having low social support, right? So if you don't have a lot of people around you, if you're living in a new city when something traumatic takes place, you don't have that support network around you, or maybe you don't have a lot of friends. Maybe you're really, really busy trying to keep all the balls in the air, and you don't have a lot of time for a social life, and that can be really straining when we're thinking about kind of recovery from trauma, and also about having that well of resilience that you need in order to be there and be present for yourself and for your children. The other one I want to highlight here is low self esteem. And low self esteem is an interesting one because if you come to the table with negative thoughts and beliefs about yourself, with a sense of self that is not great, what we find is that the bounce back from traumatic events, that resilience is much harder to come by. And so it's really important that in your life, that you can focus on things that can help you build your self esteem. That might mean changing relationships, changing behaviors, seeking out therapy, doing things that really help you to build that. Now, all that stuff is really negative. Let's look at what's positive. Let's look at what's helpful. Oh, let me go back 1 second because I can't leave risk factors without talking about substances. We can effectively anything too much, right? TV too much, eat too much, sleep too much, drink too much, do too many drugs, right? And substance use goes without saying, right? That's always like everybody says, when don't use substances when you have suffering in your life, because it doesn't make it better. And they're right. It doesn't make it better. It may alleviate some symptoms in the short term, but it actually makes the long-term outcomes worse. So now I've said my little pitch there. I'm going to move over to protectives. Protectives are the things that lift us up, having a support network, taking care of ourselves through diet and exercise, having healthy relationships or seeking out healthier relationships, because sometimes it is that we have found ourselves in a relationship or set of relationships that don't work, that are causing us suffering, and that are maybe part of the traumatic experience altogether. And it's very hard to build resilience when you don't have somebody who's rooting for you, who's kind of helping you out, who's telling you that maybe it's not going to be okay, because it might not be okay for a while, but telling you that they're in your corner and that they believe in you. Having regular work. Regular work doesn't seem like it would be a protective factor, but it absolutely is. And it is because when we experience trauma, when our children go through traumatic experience, the world it blows up, right? Everything kind of goes, excuse my French, ass over tea kettle for a moment or many moments. And, you know, our sense of safety, our sense of stability kind of is disrupted. So having regular work, a job to go to, a thing that you can count on that is just like it was the day before and the day before that and the day before that is very grounding. And it really helps us to kind of feel like we have some control. The last one I want to touch on here is faith or having some kind of spiritual life. Um, we're not going to get way into that tonight because this is not that kind of discussion, but having some kind of faith or spirituality is really helpful in building of protective factors and building of resilience, because even when you feel alone by through your faith, you don't feel so alone, right? There's someone walking alongside of you. Make sense? Hope so. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do? We didn't ask for this. We certainly didn't invite it. We don't want it, but we've got it. So, how do we deal? How do we cope? What is it that we can do to create better bounce back? Um, all right. So when we think about this, what I would like us to focus on is understanding that we do have some things that are within our control. We do have some things that we can have power over. And often when we have a traumatic experience and our wells are empty, it's very hard to feel like we have any kind of power over anything. However, again, going back, you didn't ask for it, you didn't want it, but it happened. And what you do about it is what you can control. How you manage it, how you deal with it. Do you push it under the rug and not deal with it for 20 years? Maybe, right? Or do you come to a place in your life where maybe you've decided that your life doesn't feel like it's in your control anymore and things aren't going well and you need to make some kind of a change, do some things differently. So in building resilience and growing recovery, when we're talking about things we can control, we start right where we are. Look at things like our self-care, who supports us, caring for our bodies, getting treatment if that's what we need. Even things as simple, well, not simple, but even things like our phone and how much time we spend on our phones, right? What we look at, the news programs that we watch, all of those can be very impactful in activating us, making us more anxious, or they can help us feel less anxious, more grounded, more connected to ourselves. And so it's really important that we kind of take time to think about our lives and what we're doing that's working and what we're doing that maybe isn't working. Did you want to interject something here, Susie?
I did actually. I learned an example of that in a very interesting way back after my son's accident, and something that came in handy when parenting not just him but my other children the years after. We were involved in a lawsuit after his accident, and the opposing counsel was very contentious, bullying kind of gentleman. And normally I will get very angry, and when I get angry I can't formulate sentences and get very anxious in those situations, and I'd never been involved in anything like that before. But the day before, ironically, and I guess somewhat fortuitously, I was chatting with a friend who told me about a study she had read about in a high maximum security prison where the psychologist or psychiatrist who was working with the inmates tried an experiment over the course of a year where in all his interactions with the inmates, he would project loving and compassionate thoughts. He didn't change his interactions, he just changed his thoughts. And what they found over the course of a year was the prison aggression went remarkably down. So ironically, I had this conversation with her the day before the deposition, and I thought, well, what's the harm? Why not try it? And I did, and was shocked at how composed and articulate and able to deal with this man that normally would have just rendered me not very articulate. So I started using that at home or in when interactions with difficult family members. Even I would just have a mantra in my head of either, I don't know, something compassionate, love wins, or whatever works for you, but something that its basis was in compassion and love. And it sounds a little silly and even woo-woo, but it actually helped me a lot. So I thought I'd share that.
That's awesome, Susie. I love that you use the word woo woo in a sentence. That rocks. Um, but yes, so finding the things, trying sometimes things that seem like they might be woo woo to you. Um, you never know until you try what could be helpful. And so when we're talking about managing our traumatic experience and still trying to be that parent that is leaning into our kids and caring for them and taking care of them, we're so full after something terrible happens with our children of worry and concern and fear and anxiety and maybe anger and rage at the situation that it can be really hard to remember to think about ourselves, if that makes sense. Right? We're so leaning forward, we're so focused on our child, on our family system, on the situation, and all that all that energy is going out. And so it seems counterintuitive for Susie and I to sit here and say, well, you got to turn that some of that energy back in. But you do. And the reason is that if all of your energy is extending outward in trying to help your child or help the siblings, help your husband or wife, or deal with the situation in the community, and you don't do anything to take care of yourself, or you don't even notice that anything is changing inside of you, um, then eventually it's going to kind of hit you in the face, right? Something bigger is going to happen. And if you want further information on that, go back and look at something like the ACE study out of Kaiser Permanente. If you can read the synopsis of that or find literature on that, it's a longitudinal study. It's still going on now. And it talks about trauma and its impact, not just on our mental well-being or our emotional well-being, but on things like our finances, our education, chronic illness, our ability to find and keep relationships. So it's pervasive, and I would take a look at it if you're interested, just to see that when we don't turn inward and take care of ourselves in the ways that we need to, it does manifest in other ways eventually.
And the
Um,
piece about the body is key. I never really used to know how to say that. I didn't really understand what it meant to get to know what your body's telling you until I started stopping and thinking for a moment, well, what is going on in the body? Because we're so up here all the time. But I have found that my body will let me know what's happening before my brain will, be it in the form of a stiff neck or an anxiety, low-level anxiety all day. And you can't always answer, what is it telling me, but at least you can be curious and say, well, it's telling me something. Um,
yeah, absolutely. And you're really quite correct there. Your body, the physical changes inside your body from top to bottom often are telling your brain what it's supposed to be thinking or feeling, right? So if you're a person who experiences anxiety, and I don't know who does or who doesn't right now, but for me, when I'm anxious, it's all in my belly, right? Roiling tummy, I get butterflies. It's not fun. But it's also akin to the signal in my brain for hunger, right? So, because when we're hungry, our stomach growls, it feels so. When we tune into ourselves and take time to get to know from top to bottom where you carry your stress, where you carry your upset, where it manifests in the body, and how we see it, right? Pounding heart, sweaty palms, roiling stomach, a choking sensation in your throat, confused thinking. There's all sorts of different kind of signs that manifest themselves. So getting to understand what yours are, and that's when we talk about, control the things you can. Get to know what your body's telling you. It's talking to you. You just got to put on some different ears to be able to listen. Um, Other controlling things that other kind of variables and controlling things that you can always has to do with self-care. We're going to take a deep dive into that in the next slide, so I'm not going to do more on that right now. But it's important to ask yourself a question. When you find yourselves in a place like this and you're thinking about building your own resilience, have you dealt with your own previous traumas? Have you gotten, have you been able to process them? That doesn't necessarily mean have you gone to therapy. Not everybody needs to go to therapy for everything. I'm certainly an advocate of it because look what I do for a living. And there's a lot of benefit to the therapeutic alliance and to a therapeutic relationship with somebody that's not a family member or a friend who can give you, expert advice and evidence-based interventions to help you through things. But not everybody needs that. But it's time now, right? If your well is empty or really, really low, and you're thinking about how do I fill that up again so that I can bounce back better? Have you dealt with your own stuff? If you haven't, maybe it's time to think about taking a step in that direction. Because what we know from lived experience as well as um, technical expertise is that you know we can recover from traumatic events, and we can heal and we can be resilient and we can do all of that. But there are residual impacts. There are little things or little sensitivities that we can carry through over time. If you understand what those things are, so you're kind of becoming an intentional operational expert on yourself, then you can adjust or choose differently. You may not do it all the time, but that's okay, right? We're perfectly imperfect. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. But if you can do it more often than you're doing it now, you will find a better and more positive outcome. Taking time for yourself. I put this here because of the same reason that we talked about energy out and energy in. When our children are going through something, we don't take time for ourselves. We don't take time for ourselves, most of the time. We don't take a sufficient amount of time in being with self. But especially when you have had suffering or are going through suffering in your house, all that energy is going out. If you don't take time for yourself, you're not able to recharge and refill. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in the next slide. Especially these last couple pieces, getting to know what your body is telling you, teaching those things to your kids, not about your body, but about their body. I want to clarify, right? You're not going to share with them, here's what happened to me today. You're going to want to elicit from them, but you can use the techniques that you learn or the things that work for you to talk with them about what might work for them and
Yeah, and
what.
also kids like often can't answer those questions of what's going on with them cognitively, and it can be very annoying for them to be continually asked, like, "What's wrong? What's wrong? Are you okay?" But to put it into the body, well, what's your body telling you? How's your stomach? How is that today? Your head? Let them just start planting the seed of having them observe their body. It's a nice thing to grow up with.
It is a nice thing to grow up with. Absolutely. And it is really quite helpful. So as we step away from um, managing our own traumatic experience while caring for other people, we're going to dive a little bit more. And we're actually quite ahead of time tonight. I don't know, I must be talking really fast. And I've been that extra cup of coffee I had before the meeting. That's good. We'll have more time for discussion and more time for questions. Um, if we think about controlling what we can and what that looks like, I have included in your packet a self-assessment. This is for you to do on your own. You can chuck it if you want. You don't have to download it. There's nothing to do here if you don't want to. But if you choose to, The self-assessment actually is a wheel design that's taken out of a course called Mental Health First Aid. It's very similar to something that we use there that I would highly recommend for all of you to take as parents or caregivers. It really, there's a portion of that training or a part of that platform that's focused on adults who interact or are in the lives of young people and helping children to more effectively regulate their emotions, deal with difficulties, how to, for us as adults, how to talk and listen in a way that helps a child feel heard, seen, safe, right? It also teaches you how to access resources, when to get help, right? When you need more. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend you taking that. If you go to the National Council for Mental Well-being, that's where you will find the course listings, and you can just sign up. It's online. It's easy. It's not too terribly expensive. Um, so I would highly recommend. But going back to the self assessment has multiple components. It looks at your physical health, it asks you to look at your emotional health. How do you handle problems? Are you emotionally pretty even? Are you really flat and down low? Or do you tend to be up here and a little bit on the hyper activated side? We have kind of and I should have included this graphic, maybe I can for the next pieces that we do, but we have a zone in within ourselves of optimal emotional functioning. When we're in that green zone, we can think clearly, we respond in a healthy way to our feelings and the feelings of other people. But sometimes when we become activated, either something is triggering us, or we feel threatened somehow, or we're feeling uncomfortable in a situation, we can go one of two ways. One way that goes up is hyper arousal, right? That place where we are scanning the environment for safety. We are constantly like reading people's faces, verbal and nonverbal cueing in the whole situation. And it's a very activating, stressful place to be. Um, Often that's a residual of traumatic experience. I will say that even at my ripe old age of, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, I still experience small periods of hypervigilance. When certain variables line up, I can feel my body turn on, right? And
Same here, and that used to happen, especially when my kids were little, and especially having grown up myself in a chaotic environment. One thing that helped is something my sister actually said to me, which is if you're hysterical, it's historical. And that stayed with me, going back to what Catherine said about dealing with your own stuff. And it would actually, if I was bordering on getting hysterical, it would occasionally help, be like, this isn't about them. This is about something else.
right, and that's a great phrase. I'm going to steal that from you, Susie. I've never heard that before. That's awesome. But it's true when we ask ourselves or make statements like that. This isn't about the situation in front of me. This is about something else. It allows us as individuals to think and broaden the scope of understanding of the situation in front of us and our response to it. And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about getting to those places where we have different choice points than we had before, right? Because in the past, you would have hypothetically responded in one way to this type of situation and maybe not the way you wanted to respond. And now when you say, okay, well, wait a minute, this is coming from a different place. Maybe I can make a different choice here. Maybe I need to step away, or maybe I need to handle this differently, or maybe I need to ask for clarification, right? So all super important things to kind of understand about ourselves. Um, the 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 self-assessment also talks about cognition. It talks about our social relationships, um, healthy versus unhealthy relationships. It talks about things like our finances. Who would think that in a self-assessment there'd be a finance section? But there is, and it's not, again, you're filling this out on your own. Nobody's going to see anything. It's not a place where you put down all your banking numbers. But it's how do you what's your relationship like with money? Are you, is your relationship with money healthy right now? Or are you struggling in some way, shape, or form? Does that need some work? So the self assessment is really designed to kind of ask you to look at these different variables and say, yeah, I'm doing good here. Or, nah, I haven't really thought about that. One of the variables is the environment. What's your relationship like with the world? You know, the big blue ball. What is your relationship like with that? Do you do anything that gives back to the world these days? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, maybe you give too much, right? Because that can be a problem too. That it's, rather than not giving it all. Um, but are you in a positive stance, a neutral stance, or maybe it really needs some work? Something has to be addressed. And so, what happens when you complete this exercise for yourself? I would suggest taking the sheet and getting another sheet of paper and just, make headings and answer for yourself in a couple of sentences. What is your, let's say, what is my emotional life like lately? Right? And take, don't take the last year, maybe take the last 5 or 6 months, or you could do it even shorter. If you've been struggling, you could do it the last month or the last 2 weeks. Where am I at? What's going well? What is not? And then leave that and go on to the next section and answer for each section kind of where you are. And what you get at the end um, is really it can be used as a map if you choose to. And it's a map for self-care planning. And the self-care planning is what builds the resilience back. One suggestion I have here for folks, and this is what I when I use the self-assessment or self-assessment tools like this in my own private practice, what I will typically do is ask my clients to fill it out and then put it away for a day or two, right? Put it away, let go do something else, take some space from it, and then come back to it when you're fresh, when you're feeling more emotionally regulated, because sometimes doing one of these assessments can be, um, it can be a little bit upsetting. It can be disconcerting to see, oh, wow, I think I have some work to do in these areas, or look at how many areas I have to do work in. And we want to kind of beat ourselves up a little bit or give ourselves a hard time. And that isn't really something that helps us to change, right? That helps us to stay stuck. And to stay stuck in that negativity. And we don't, that's not the point of this exercise. Certainly, getting stuck in negativity or beating yourself up in your head with negative cognitions or thought distortions are what help you to, really struggle and have your resilience drain even more, have your ability to bounce back not bounce very well. So it's important to kind of come at this with kindness. So when we talk about creating a self-care plan, so we've come back to our um, our self-assessment sheet, and we're taking a look and kind of trying to take an honest assessment. Okay, I need some help in these areas and help in these areas, and this area I'm really struggling with, but this area I'm doing very well. Um, my suggestion here is choose one small thing. Don't try and look at it in total and then plan out 6 different things that I'm going to join a gym and I'm going to volunteer every Saturday to clean up, you know, debris on the beach. I live in Florida and I live not far from the beach. So there's always people out doing beach pickup. And I'm going to start going to church because I never go to church anymore. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Don't try and do all that. Why not? Because it's unsustainable, right? It's unsustainable to make multiple changes, especially radical ones, all at the same time. And the idea with resilience building and the idea with trauma recovery is that this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It takes time to you know to have kind of that grinding effect, that negative impact from the traumatic experience. It takes time for unhealthy habits to grow. So it's going to take time for you to kind of reverse that process or change that process.
I
So
think too people often underestimate the power of baby steps. We often hear, "Oh, you gotta exercise, you gotta eat right," but, I know a woman who for exercising first started with taking a walk to her mailbox every day, and then that turned into a little bit farther, and then, by the end of a few months, she was doing a mile, but that's huge. It doesn't mean starting to jog, or it doesn't mean switching to the keto diet or whatever. Just adding another, an apple. We underestimate because we hear so much about the people who do big things, but those things actually are very, very pivotal.
absolutely, and I can't stress that enough, Susie, right? When I talk about creating change with my clients in therapy and they identify things that they want to have be different, this is exactly the kind of protocol that we use. It's choosing one small thing that is in in an effort toward your goal, right? If my goal is to be healthier in my body, right? That's something that we often neglect because of we have busy lives, we some of us have two jobs, we have kids, so we don't eat right, we don't exercise. And
And a key thing in this slide, if is the word controlling for what you can, because there are things that, we think we can control and just we may not be able to. I'm thinking of an example from when we were having a difficult time in our house with our son, and um, people were saying you should get a parenting coach. And I had already had my own therapist, but parenting coach, I would say back, I don't need that. This is what I do, and this is the field I'm in. Why would we do that? Well, that turned out to be one of the best things we ever did. Luckily, my husband pushed for that, because it's different when it's your own child. You are not the expert, and that the putting the focus on us for a little while and working with a coach who had experience with childhood trauma, that was a key thing. She had a lot of experience with this issue. It didn't solve everything, but it softened the environment. Our son saw us focusing a little more on ourselves rather than on him all the time. And in turn, that had a ripple effect of softening the interactions. And it was a very wise decision.
thank you for sharing that, Susie. I remember us talking about that and just how impactful that was for you, and especially kind of having to come to the realization or that aha moment, like, oh, okay, maybe, this is what I do for a living. I can handle it. I don't need that. And then kind of seeing the benefit after trying it.
Yep.
Goes to your husband for pushing for that.
Yep.
Um, we're talking about developing new skills and implementing new skills. It's a baby step at a time. It's a small change over time, committing to one thing at a time. We often have behaviors that we engage in for self-soothing or self-care that aren't the greatest, but they're not terrible. I don't know about you all, but I've had a ton of them over the course of my life. Um, and so one of the ways or one of the things that I'm personally working on right now is, for me, TV is like the panacea of all things. It's, to sit down and watch a mindless television program and disconnect from myself. It's like amazing. However, spending too much time doing anything like that, is that good for me? Does that add value to my life? Does that help me with my self-care planning and my goals? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Um, and so that's kind of a thing that I recognized and I identified. Like, okay, yeah, you use TV as an escape when you've had a tough day or you're having a lot of stress, and maybe there's something better that you can put in place instead of doing that. So I don't know if you can see the pink ball behind me. You might be able to. I've taken up crochet. I'm terrible, but I'm teaching myself to crochet in lieu of watching a 30-minute junky TV program that adds nothing to my life. I'm really very bad. I can't even make an even square yet. But That doesn't mean that I don't watch any television. It just means that I add in this one small thing. So even if I spend 30 minutes 3 times a week, frustrating myself with a crochet hook and a ball of yarn, that's, an hour and a half that I don't, on my break time that I don't spend watching, as my father would have called it, the idiot box, right?
I don't want to cut you off, but we do have a question when you're ready.
Okay.
That's more for you.
And we're almost there. So before we is this a question that pertains to this, or this is a question that we have questions in the chat?
Pertains to earlier.
Okay. So let me get through these last two things, and then I think we
Okay.
on this last slide, this is kind of what I want to leave you with. Um, these pieces are important. Understanding what your resources in the community are is important. Get on Google, find out what's in your community. Find out, where the therapists are, where the support groups are, where moms are getting together and having, play groups or meetups. Find your people. Find community resources that can help you with whatever stressors or whatever things are going on. Um, and they're going to be different everywhere. So I wish I could be more specific, but I can't. The one thing that, how are we doing? Oh, the one thing that I do want to leave you with is this slide. I'm not going to talk about it a bunch because I want to get on to questions while we still have time. But recovery from trauma is absolutely possible. Building resilience and building that bounce back is absolutely possible. It requires changing one small thing, right? Taking that first step on the journey. It requires stick to itiveness and tenacity. So when you fall on your butt, get back up and start again. It requires people, right? People in your corner, whether that's friends or loved ones, healthy relationships, your pastor, an AA group, or your therapist and psychiatrist, your treatment team, right? Get those people around you. Re-regulate your system and be gentle with.
Breathing is great for re-regulating your system, by the way. And we don't realize sometimes that we're not breathing right. And there's a lot of apps out there, and if you Google, there's something called holotropic breath work, and it's quite powerful. And you can literally feel your system changing when you do it.
Mhm. We put into the packet that we're going to give you guys tonight something called 5 4 3 2 1 breathing, or yeah, is it 5 4? No, it's not 5 4 3 2 1. It's breathing in the box. Grounding is the 5 4 3 2 1. We've included a lot of stuff, so feel free, take it, use it, share it. It's all out there on the interweb for free consumption, so we're just passing it along. All right, so I know we had some questions. Why don't we shift back over to that?
We have a question from Jessica. Do we have any webinars or training or resources for adult children that have experienced childhood trauma, especially with a relationship with their parent? For example, living with a codependent parent.
Ooh, great question. I just stopped my share so I can bring us all kind of back into the room. We don't have anything that we've created currently. But there are resources out there. I'm trying to think. Do you know of any off the top of your head, Susie?
Hmm. For adult children that have,
Mhm.
I mean, I know of books. I would, highly recommend Nadine Burke Harris. She was the former Surgeon General of California, and oh gosh, the name of her book is, I'm blanking, but she is the author. Um, but I'd have to think about that. Off the top of my head, I don't.
Again, if you're willing to email us after this or PM us after this with an email address for you, or make some kind of connection, we can help with that research and find it, because I'm sure that it's out there.
Yeah,
Uh,
so the email is easy. It's traumainformedparent@gmail.com.
mhm. And you're welcome, Jessica. Now I finally I'm done talking, so I can look and see where everybody's from.
Yeah, but we've got to wrap up in a minute. I wanted to remind everyone too that we'll be posting our next offering, which will be 12-week small group coaching sessions, and we'll offer more opportunity for small group interaction. And I believe we have everyone's email, so I'll make sure to send that information.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for taking an hour out of your life that you can't get back to come and be with us and to talk about these issues and ask pertinent questions and let you know that there will be more time and more opportunity to come back and kind of work together again in a small group capacity, and look out for more webinars from Susie and I. Um, we'll have more, we're creating more content all the time. So
Definitely. Yep. And let us know if there's any particular topic you'd like to hear more about.
absolutely.
So thanks for
Absolutely.
joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.